starting the session on transparency and accountability. Transparency and accountability. We don't have a lot of audience.
Well, did they all go to the other panel?
I don't think so. I think a lot of people have also left, and maybe, it's the
Going
last
to the city.
session. So.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Because there weren't that many people even, outside there before. So I think a lot of people might have left, but maybe we'll still start. But do you want to wait for a few more minutes to start the bigger audience? For the first one. Or maybe they'll come in when we start talking. All right, good afternoon. So transparency and accountability is the thematic area of the last session. Let's keep the door open if people still want to join in. Don't know if they can hear us. My name is Sanna Takala, and I work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, and I've promised to chair this session. We're looking into transparency and accountability. These are, of course, thematic areas that we've already touched in various sessions, I think, before, at least in this room. But now in this session, we'll be looking into it in 3 different perspectives through 3 different research. So firstly, from the view of beneficiaries, and why does it matter for the beneficiaries to also understand sort of the logic behind the interventions. Secondly, we'll be looking it through a security sector reform and focusing on police oversight. And then thirdly, also looking at the NGOs' managerial motivations, which I think is a very interesting topic as well. Okay, let's get started. So firstly, we'll have a presentation from Carlos Cos from the University of Bergen. The floor is yours.
So let me just get settled. Okay, all right. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlo Kos. I'm an associate professor at the University of Bergen at the Department of Government. Importantly, this is joint and ongoing work with my co-PIs, Alexander de Juan and Paul Hoffman, 2 brilliant scholars I have the joy of working with. So in this project, what we are doing is we are trying to test the effects of large-scale, customized, and low-cost information campaigns on citizen-state interactions in the context of ongoing development activities in Mali and in Niger. The project itself is funded by the German KfW Development Bank, among others, to assess whether such information campaigns can become a sort of low-cost communication strategy in future development activities. So it's a little bit experimental from that perspective. So I want to give you a little bit of background and motivation for this project. At its core, aid to fragile states pursues 2 primary objectives. The first one is rather direct. It's about improving access to basic services such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, water, electricity, and so on. And these direct objectives are actually often achieved even under really challenging logistical and security challenges. The second objective aims to contribute to sustainable state-society relations and social cohesion, among others to reduce the risk of future conflict, displacement, migration, terrorism, and so on and so on. So this is obviously an extremely ambitious aim and contingent on factors that are usually widely outside donor countries' realm of influence. However, donors can potentially, at least partially, influence how aid is delivered and what information citizens receive before planning, during implementation, and after implementation of aid projects. And such information should, for instance, address lingering questions, including who is the responsible institutions, what are the selection criteria and the allocation processes, where are projects implemented, what type of projects and why not another type of project, who are the targeted beneficiaries and who are not targeted beneficiaries. So these are questions that are actually for any citizens of relevance to understand policy making on the ground. There is another thing. So providing information to citizens on aid projects can have important implications. First, information can empower citizens to understand formal rules and responsibilities. Second, it can enable citizens to seek more information, engage with local state officials, and over time, through repeated interactions, foster sustainable state-society relations from the bottom up. And third, knowledge of the formal rules, selection criteria, allocation mechanisms, and so on, can reduce perceptions of unfairness between beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries. So, how well are citizens in aid-receiving communities actually informed? So, in reality, citizens in communities often even lack the most basic information about what type of projects are being implemented, why they are implemented, why they have been selected, who is responsible, and so on. So here are some quotes from a really excellent book called Time to Listen by Anderson et al. I don't want you to read the whole quotes, but I think they are quite reflective and illustrative. But the highlighted quotes actually basically stand out in emphasizing that people just don't know why certain beneficiaries are selected while others are not, right? And you can imagine that this is really, it could be a problem, right? Because you nurture perceptions of unfairness and partiality. These quotes do also match quite well with research Alexander De Juan, so my co-author, and I did, among others, in Afghanistan, Peru, and Burundi, where we found that very few people, on average 50% in aid-receiving communities, really know who is responsible, why projects have been selected, but the majority of people would answer to our surveys, well, it's probably some local politician, it's some influential families, and we further found that this is often associated with perceptions of unfairness and latent conflicts about the distribution of resources. So there is a lot to lose and potentially to gain here by providing better information to local citizens. Okay. So what other evidence do we have on aid and state-society relations? There are several studies that look at the impact of aid on state-society relations, for instance, political trust or engagement with state authorities and officials. The evidence, I would say, is overall quite mixed. So there are some studies that find that aid projects do really foster state-society relations. Others find no evidence on state-society relations, although finding effects on better access to services. So this indicates that just providing better access doesn't necessarily contribute to improved state-society relations. And then there are other studies that find that aid can potentially even lead to violent conflict over distributional conflicts over resources. Where is the receiver? Here. Okay. So in this project, we basically focus on two related questions. Can customized public information campaigns first increase citizens' engagement with the local state? And second, can these campaigns also reduce intergroup envy and distributional conflicts? In a sense, we are moving away from concepts like political trust, right? So for instance, when people are asked in surveys, to what extent do you trust the national parliament, the government, the judiciary? questions like these are quite common, actually, when we talk about political trust and state-society relations, but we thought quite long about that and thought that how can you really influence that, right? That is a very long causal chain from an intervention to improving political trust. And we thought that the best you can probably hope for is that you increase engagement between citizens and local state officials at the local level. That is something more concrete that results in real behavioral exchanges, actually. Now, what do we mean with customized information campaigns? So we think that information in the context of development aid needs to be specific, it needs to be relevant, and it needs to be adapted to the local community context. So that means it should include who is the responsible authority, what are the formal selection and allocation mechanisms, and also how much does a project cost, how long does it take to implement, and so on. So it should be really specific and not too general to be influential and beneficial to citizens. So here's an illustration of our underlying theoretical model, which is, of course, extremely simplified, right? So, but it should describe how and under what conditions information campaigns can theoretically impact and improve state-society relations at the local level and reduce distributional conflicts and affect social cohesion. So there are two main connecting mechanisms. There are probably many more, but we, based on prior research and literature, one is that with more information, you're better informed, right? So you're better informed to participate in political discussions, which we frame as political efficacy. The second one is that by knowing the formal rules of engagement, the formal rules of selection and allocation, you kind of have a tool in your hands that gives you some sense of how aid should be distributed and thereby reduce perceptions of distributional conflicts. This is, of course, these are formal rules, right? There is a difference in the extent to which these formal rules are adhered by local authorities on the ground. Now, this model is, of course, oversimplified, no doubt about that, but that's what we do in quantitative research. There are lots of contextual factors that play into this that could affect the relationship between information on the one side and an outcome like state-society relations at the local level on the other side. What we consider here are three key contextual factors. So on the one hand side, it matters probably to what extent an individual expects to benefit from a specific aid intervention. So if you imagine that a school project is going to be implemented, like let's say a few classrooms are built, it matters to you more if you have children than if you have no children. Second, it matters probably to what extent you already have prior knowledge about planned development initiatives. So if you already have a lot of knowledge, additional information may not have a lot of influence on how you engage with the state. And third, I mentioned that before, so the formal rules that can be delivered in an information campaign do not necessarily match with the de facto implementation on the ground. So it depends probably to what extent people believe that political authorities on the ground adhere to the formal rules. So let me get to the empirical design of this study. In order to assess the causal impact of information, what we do is we designed and implement a randomized controlled trial where in Mali and in Niger, together with partners from the Malian government and a survey company. So what we do is we conduct surveys and we randomly assign survey participants into a control group which gets no information, gets information after the program for ethical reasons. People in treatment 1 receive a bunch of information on selection criteria, responsible institution, and very localized project-specific information. And then we have a treatment 2 group which gets this information, but also gets a feedback opportunity. So we thought, okay, of course, giving information is a good thing, but typically communication consists of a two-way street, right? So you give information, you can give information back, and that's what we try to reflect in this second treatment. So what is important here is that we implement this treatment within the first survey wave, and we immediately afterwards ask people about a bunch of outcome questions that reflect our theoretical model. But we implement 3 survey waves in each country. So we can observe extremely short-term effects, but in the next survey waves, we can also observe mid-term and somewhat more long-term effects to see if these effects change or manifest stronger over time. Okay. Now, what kind of data do we use? So as I mentioned, we focus in each country, Mali and Niger, we implement 3 panel surveys. In Mali, we focus on a region in the south called Sikasso. It's a relatively peaceful area compared to the central part of Mali. So with regards to violent events, this is relatively rare. It's, of course, in a rather insecure place compared to more stable countries in West Africa. But it's not the hardest case within Mali, so to say. And what we do is we focus on 20 German-funded aid activities in Sikasso. The reason for that is that we use these aid activities not to assess the impact of the aid activity, but to basically flank these information campaigns along these aid activities. So these aid activities include the extension of schools, the construction of classrooms, of water points, water towers. So basically what we can broadly label social infrastructure. The responsibility for this program is with the Malian government, and we collaborate here with a government agency called Anicité. So this agency is responsible for decentralization projects for all of Mali. And in each country, we survey 5,200 households in the first survey wave. And I want to give you a brief indication of the preliminary results of this first survey wave. So these are really just very short-term effects after the treatment has been delivered. And what it shows is actually on the left-hand side that we find very weak positive effects. So the point estimates are positive, but the uncertainty intervals are too large to speak of any significant effects here. We are, on the one hand side, a little bit, somewhat disappointed that it didn't show any effects, but also on the other hand side, not really surprised that such a short time after the treatment information was given, that it doesn't automatically result in different attitudes and anticipated behavior. So these null effects from the first survey wave account for both perceptions of state-society relations as well as social cohesion measures. We do a bunch of other heterogeneity analysis. So for instance, we test whether this information positively affects political efficacy, so whether people believe that they are better informed. There's also not really much going on in terms of effects. We test whether people perceive distributional fairness as increased, also not much going on here. And then we also test these conditional effects that I mentioned in the theoretical model. And we also find here not very significant effects. The only thing that we find so far is that if people know less about the project before, the information treatment results in positive effects on state-society relations. So it's, in a way, not that promising, but also not that surprising, and we're looking forward to the results from the first and third survey wave, which are more about long-term persistence. One thing that we did, actually, was to look into one of the effects that were strongest. which we didn't anticipate, and these were interviewer effects. So we basically included interviewer fixed effects, so controlling for each interviewer, and we found that the interviewers themselves had the strongest effects on the outcomes that we measured. And we wanted to know more, well, what could be the reason for that, and try to somehow decompose what is really an interviewer effect. And then we measured the time an interviewer took to deliver the treatment information, and found that when interviewers rushed through this treatment information and really talked quickly so that the respondents possibly could not understand or distill this information, the treatment effects were actually insignificant. But when the interviewer took more time, we find these expected effects on positive associations about state-society relations at the local level. So this is interesting in its own right, because it's nothing that we anticipated actually, but I think one outcome of that is like, sure, if you give information, it also matters how you give it, right? So let me conclude. I'm not sure how I'm doing time, but I didn't get any fingers. Okay, thank you. So to conclude, what we find is a very weak short-term effects that are conditionally sometimes significant. So in a way, we're not that surprised to not find any effects on these really short-term effects. We find some conditional effects depending on prior knowledge and the treatment length. We surprisingly didn't find anything that triggered the mechanisms, which we thought are much closer to the treatment if you consider it in a causal chain. We think that in wave 2 and 3, we may find some more stronger effects, because it takes time to, if you give me information, if a political party gives me information, I also don't change my opinion right on the spot, right? So this might be actually quite plausible. So moving forward to the second and third survey wave, respondents now get text messages being reminded that they are being contacted again. We also have updated the treatment a little bit, giving them now information about a new funding round that is currently going on, where local mayors and local councils need to prepare proposals to get these projects funded. So that gives respondents a little bit of an incentive to engage. And we also now include a behavioral outcome measure where people can, they receive a compensation for their time, like very small, $0.5, and they can decide whether they want to keep that for themselves or donate it to a Malian civil society organization focusing on transparency and citizen-state relationships. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. Overall, this is ongoing work, and if you are interested in that, get in touch with us. We appreciate comments, suggestions, critique. We can still incorporate some of that. And if you're interested in the paper, so far it's only the pre-analysis plan. It's available at this URL. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlo, and very well kept time. He had 20 minutes and it was 20 exactly, so very impressive. We'll have questions later on. So now we're moving to the next presentation, who will be Professor Christina Ek, joining online from Uppsala, I think. Let us check if the connection is working. Yes? So the floor is yours, Christine. We can't hear you yet, but I think you can hear us. Now it's good. We can hear you.
There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Let's try this again. So, share. My apologies. Get this going. All right, I hope you can see my slides now. So thank you for the invitation to be here, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I've included my email on this slide, and so if anyone is interested in chatting or reaching out afterwards, feel free to drop me an email. My presentation is about police oversight in post-conflict peace agreements, which has, a starting place I think we're all familiar with from the news, that police violence and police abuse occurs throughout the world in most countries. And there are ongoing discussions about that pretty much globally at this point. But these problems are, I think, particularly acute in post-conflict countries, which are characterized by weak state institutions and legacies of violence. And there's a risk for, security sector abuse to sort of reignite grievances. In many sort of post-conflict countries, the police were key actors in the armed conflict. They were involved in fighting the armed conflict, or they're otherwise associated with repression. Activities like illegal detention and torture, disappearances, extrajudicial killings, as well as other forms of misconduct like corruption. And so in post-conflict settings, what we see is that security sector reform usually focuses on bringing the military, so the army, if they were deployed, back into the barracks, but the police may remain deployed, so to speak, throughout the country because they're meant to provide security. And as a consequence, social security sector reform has typically sort of addressed this issue, addressed the police, usually by improving training and recruitment in various ways, usually with the aim of enhancing capacity in order to prevent crime, terrorism, all sorts of sort of violence by non-state actors. Right. The problem, or less attention anyway, I would say, has been paid to institutional solutions in terms of thinking about ways in which state institutions can address the potential violence and abuse that police engage in vis-a-vis the civilian population. So in many countries across the world, there are police misconduct oversight institutions. There's sometimes they're local, sometimes they're national, that are designed to monitor and control police through institutional channels. But at the same time, there hasn't been a lot of serious attention to these institutions, even in democracies, and they're far from ubiquitous. There's considerable variation within the United States, for example, as the picture here suggests, but there's also considerable variation whether these even exist and what they look like in Europe, for example, right? So these institutions are basically governmental bodies mandated with processing complaints against the police. So that's kind of key to this, that this is a mechanism for citizens to give feedback to the state about problems they're having with the police. They can take many different forms and names. So they can be ombudsman, they can be internal affairs, so embedded within policing, or they can be independent oversight boards. And there's a lot of discussions about, which of these are best, but we don't really have good scientific evidence on that at this point. But just to give you an example, so where you're at in Belgium, the Comité P acts as an independent body that exercises oversight over all the police forces as well as the executive branch. So this is sort of typical of a misconduct oversight body that I'm interested in studying. And just to point out that the mandates and the powers and the way these are designed can vary quite a lot across countries. And so that isn't the focus necessarily here with this project. This project is just to identify whether they exist. But certainly the next step is also to look at sort of what they do, what they're able to do, and how, who's in charge of them. Are they within police or not? Those sorts of questions. Right. So how I went about looking at whether there were police misconduct oversight bodies in post-conflict peace agreements is I started with a list of the peace agreements from 1975 to 2011. This list already exists. I didn't do any of this work. The second step was then to look at a data set called the Police Reform and Peace Agreements, the PRPA data set. Which I also didn't create, so this is someone else's work. They have a variable in that data set that's called accountability, and they describe that as being basically formal governmental control over the national police force. So provisions that determine authority over which police force must answer to, and that takes responsibility for overseeing the officer's conduct. This is a much broader sort of concept of accountability than what I'm interested in, which is very specifically about police oversight bodies, which allow for sort of citizen complaints. So in the third step, which is where I was to go through those cases that were listed in the PRPAs, having accountability, and then look specifically at whether the peace agreement stipulated the creation of a police misconduct oversight body. So why focus on peace agreements specifically, you might ask? Because police reform can occur even if, for example, conflicts end by other means. So a conflict can end because one side wins, or it can end because it sort of peters out in terms of violence. One could even imagine scenarios where you would have police reform even in the context of ongoing. Like, I don't think it's terribly likely, but in theory, it could happen. But I think that the reason I'm focused on peace agreements, at least for this stage of this project, is because cases of conflict which are ended by peace agreement are the ones where we're most likely to see these types of bodies actually coming into existence compared to other types of sort of conflict termination. Since in these settings, both parties have come to the table, they've outlined a common plan for governmental reform. And I think in these settings that, the fact that it's the misconduct oversight body is written into the text of a peace agreement is a signal of commitment, both to domestic actors and to international actors, and therefore would be more politically costly to renege on than if the sort of police reform or the police oversight body is created through purely sort of domestic political processes or through international intervention. So I would expect this to be sort of stickier, so to say, and more difficult to dismantle. Right. So I'm going to return to this point at the end because I'm not entirely, satisfied that gets us all the way there. But I think this is sort of a first cut in terms of what I've been doing. So as we went through and collected these data, we kind of categorized three types of oversight provisions. The first is a rigorous oversight provision. So this is when an oversight body, concerning police misconduct is laid out in detail, or a commission to create such a body is specifically mandated in the text of a peace agreement. So this is what I'm actually interested in. But we did come across sort of references to these types of bodies in some sort of like kind of vague or indirect manner. And we call these partial oversight provisions. So we've recorded where that happens because it sort of is an unsure case in a way. And then we've also made note of when there are temporary international monitoring. So this is where you see sort of international actors being mandated to oversee the conduct of the police, but only temporarily. And there's no sort of detailed long-term oversight plan for the domestic actors to take over, outlined in the peace agreement. So those are the sort of three categories that we looked at. And then we also looked at whether there are de jure provisions, right? So this is, if we look at the text of the peace agreement, does it specify the creation of these bodies? But then we also wanted to look and see whether they were actually implemented. The data for that are a lot messier. We relied primarily on government web pages and emailing embassies, as well as a bunch of other secondary sources. But they were in a variety of languages in countries that often don't have good internet, or governmental ministries don't have good internet coverage. So this was a somewhat difficult task to engage in with a greater level of uncertainty than the de jure provisions. So what are the findings? Well, we find first, there are 50, so if we take step one, there are 52 conflicts ended by peace agreement for this period. So that's sort of the population we begin working with. And then we use this PRPA data set that identifies 28 of those with accountability measures. And then those were the ones where we went through and looked at the text of the agreement. And what we found there was that there were 3 cases of rigorous oversight, which is not many, 6 cases of partial oversight, and 3 cases of temporary international monitoring. So this is a fairly rare activity when we consider that rigorous oversight is what ideally we would like to be seeing here. So just to give you an example of what we found there, the rigorous oversight provisions, probably the most notable case is in Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement, which established the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland, which is civilian-led and it's independent of the police. And I think amongst sort of Western policing scholars, it's often considered to be one of the sort of most accessible, most transparent, best in a way, police misconduct oversight institutions. In El Salvador, there were also provisions for an oversight body, but there was a failure to implement those. And in Mozambique, a National Police Affairs Commission was established by presidential decree in '93, but it was reportedly extremely ineffective and quite quickly abolished. And now oversight is, as far as we can gather, an internal matter. So it basically consists of sort of books in local police stations. So this sort of falls short of the ambitions outlined in the peace agreement texts. The partial oversight provisions I won't get into, but just to stress that the reason that we're not really taking them into consideration is they tended to be temporary. They weren't directed specifically at the police. They kind of outlined very unclear structures. They were otherwise sort of too vague for us to be able to be sure that this was actually what we were looking for. Some takeaways. One is that police oversight is rarely considered in these peace agreements. This is not something that's often outlined. And here I can say, revisiting this coding, which we did maybe a year ago, we were very narrow in the way we defined police misconduct oversight institutions. So we were looking specifically for institutions that were looking at the police. But I think now, my thinking is a little bit more broad, that in fact, a lot of ombudsmen that were established in peace agreements are tasked with doing this same work, sort of, receiving complaints from citizens of human rights abuses, which police violence is. But they just have a broader ambit. They tend to do a lot more than that. And I think, my next move will be to go back through those lists of 28 accountability cases and also kind of include those ombudsman cases as well, in order to get a handle on where that happens. It's very rare, though, that we see these implemented. So it's, of the ones that we saw, the 3 cases where there were specifically police misconduct of institutions created, only one was implemented, and that was, in the UK, which is, unusually well-resourced and well-governed for the kinds of countries where armed conflict typically occurs. And then I think one of the reflections I had sort of as I was reading this literature was a kind of frustration in the way in which the field talks about what they call quite often democratic policing. And really there, the focus is often on non-state security threats. So, threats to citizen well-being from non-state actors, from terrorists, criminals, bandits, and it seems to be, I think, a neglect at times of considering threats to citizen well-being from within the state in this kind of democratic policing and post-conflict settings literature that I, for one, found somewhat frustrating. So I think sort of moving forward, I would like to, in addition to sort of broadening to include ombudsmen, I think, police reform can also come, and police oversight, and specifically police oversight institutions can come about through other processes besides peace agreements. So we see cases where, international actors are really key in developing these institutions, or where domestic actors are key in developing these institutions. And so I think that would be a way to expand these data to look and see, when do we see these not created in peace agreements, but through other types of political processes. Oopsie, sorry about that. And, I think we need to start looking at these types of institutions more in order to be able to understand, when are they actually created after peace processes and when are they not? And what effects do these bodies have on citizen sort of perceptions of trust and legitimacy in both the police and the government, much larger, considering that the police are, a really prevalent and visible arm of the government. And, I think we also need to understand when these types of processes actually lead to functioning, real, meaningful institutions, as opposed to ones that sort of act as political window dressing. So this project was sort of to try and get a sort of first cut on that issue and start looking at it. But I think there's really so much more to be done. And it's quite important since we know that police abuse is ubiquitous and it's central to kind of protecting human rights and civil rights and in ensuring opportunities for people to engage in democratic practices. It's the police that will, inhibit their ability to, demonstrate or speak freely or move freely in the countries. And so, I think it's important that they have mechanisms for informing the government and for affecting change in cases of police misconduct. And so that's what I had to share with you.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, thank you, Christina. We'll have questions later on. We still have one more presentation before that. So the floor is yours, Con Dien Dong. I hope I pronounced that correctly, from King's College. Over to you.
Okay, Choi can use it. Okay, there we go. Okay, I think I went too far. Right, okay, so I am the last person standing between you guys and Dina, so my apologies for that. So this is a joint work with Trudy Owens. She's from School of Economics. I think I'm too short for this. The School of Economics at University of Nottingham. We've been working on this paper for a few years, and we're very happy to present it today. Okay, so I will go straight into my motivation. So the key question that we are trying to answer is, what is the key motivation, the driving motivation behind NGOs' decisions? So we're trying to answer the question of why they are doing what they claim they are doing. We are looking at a very specific strategy of NGO, which is diversification. What we mean here is the number of activities or different services that NGOs are offering to their communities. The reason why we were so concerned about this strategy is we observed that in the NGO world, many NGOs started as single activity organizations, but then they decided to expand, open, offering more activities over the years. So we asked this question, why are they doing it? Of course, the noble motivation is they're trying to accommodate more and more social demands. They're trying to offer more and more services to more people. That is pretty noble. But then from the economic and management point of view, this act of diversifying is pretty costly and harmful to the development effort. We can think about the lack of focus. So maybe you started as a very development-oriented organization, and then you try to branch out to do more of business activities. That is going to be some inefficiency in their management or creating some transaction costs to their leaders. Then we have the problem of mission vagueness. Are they doing something about development? Are they doing something about business? What are they doing truly? So this raised the question of legitimacy, privileges that are associated with having more activities. From the donor perspective, if NGOs are offering more and more activities, there would be the required mechanisms to oversee those activities, to evaluate those activities would be increasingly demanding for the donors. So this is something in the economics and management literature would be of questions. So what we're trying to do in this paper is trying to answer this question. Why are they diversifying? Are they doing it for a good reason? Are they doing it for some selfish reason? We believe this is useful because we can have some answers to help design some schemes, some incentive package to incentivize pro-social behaviors, right? So if we know why people are helping people, we can try to incentivize them to do so. Most of the literature on this topic has been focused on business or finance, for-profit organizations, very much little on this NGO sector. So what are the challenges that we are focusing on this one, we are having on this one? So of course we cannot go around and ask NGOs why are they doing what they're doing, right? They will be giving us very much, They will be giving us a lot of nice and well-motivated reasons. And we don't have enough of conceptual framework to interpret the results, even if we have some information from the survey. So the way we're approaching this problem is we are going to look at the question from the theoretical approach, and then we bring our results to the empirical analysis. So the way we do it is we're trying to conceptualize the broad motivations underlying NGOs' behavior. What we're trying to do is that we categorize their motivations into two broad incentives. The first one is about operation-related motivations. So they're trying to diversify, they're trying to offer more and more activities so they can reduce the risk of being unfunded in the future. Or maybe they are working in some area and they are very good at it, and then they're trying to branch out to some related areas. So some operational-related motivations in the donor's perspective, those are the good reasons. The second broad motivation that we are going to identify is personal gain. So basically, is it the manager trying to diversify more to raise their profile, to make them more approachable, to make them more, to make them look good in the future when they go on the job market and look for another job? Is it because they're doing that to earn more money, to get more perks from being the manager of a well-diversified NGO? Or maybe just purely some impure altruism, some warm glow feeling from helping more people. So we're trying to incorporate these motivations into a theoretical framework. Then we have the following theoretical prediction. So I'm going to go briefly on this and I'll give you the intuition why it happens. So we predict that if the underlying motivation of an NGO is to help with the risk related to operational activities, then if they get a lot of income, some sudden income into their operation, they will stop diversifying. The key intuition is that because now they are guaranteed the money for the next few years, for the next few operations, they don't have to really worry about getting in more activities, offering more services to do so. But if the underlying motivation behind their decision is to get some personal gains from diversifying, then if they suddenly get a large amount of money, of donation, of income coming in to them, they would decide to diversify more, because doing so would really, really, truly benefit themselves. Okay, I will show you a few conceptual framework in a few more minutes. Now, we bring that theoretical predictions into some empirical analysis. So what we do is that we are looking at a representative sample from the Ugandan NGO sector in 2008. The reason why we chose this is because just before 2008, in 2007, they had this historic flood happening in Uganda. And then we will be using that flood and the surge in funding following the flood as our identification strategy. What we do is that we're trying to see the areas mostly affected by the floods. Oh, I think I didn't click it, sorry. Oops. So the areas that mostly are affected by the floods would be more likely to receive more funding from the donors. So they get this sudden surge in funding. So those NGOs are suddenly getting a lot of money coming in. We'll try to look at their reaction, their strategy on the number of activities that they are offering. What we are finding here is that those NGOs that rely more on the funding, on the surge of the funding from the donors, would diversify less. So after receiving a lot of money from international donations, from local donation, they decided to offer fewer activities. And this is consistent with our second motivation that I just explained a few minutes ago. So we found no evidence that NGOs are diversifying mainly, so I think the keyword here is mainly, to derive personal gains. We do find some evidence to support the need of the NGOs to reduce risks or to complement their operational activity, So we have this call for more support from donors in terms of funding and guarantee for funding on these NGOs, for these NGOs. So that's pretty much it, all of the information that I had. If you want to go for dinner now, it's the time. I'm going to the details of the paper now. I'm going to skip the related literature. What I want to emphasize that we believe this is the first paper that uses development NGO data with some plausibly exogenous variation in the income to distinguish between the two broad motivations that I talked about. Oops, oh, I forgot, I just pressed on my computer. Anyway, so this is, we believe that this is our first paper in this literature. Now, I'm not going to throw a lot of mathematical notations. I'm going to give you intuition only. If you would like to look at our terribly mathematical models, please refer to our appendix. There are plenty of notations in there, so I'm going to skip that. So what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to talk about the intuition behind our conceptual framework. The mechanism that we are using in this model is that NGOs are governed by the non-distributional constraint. That is, whatever the profits or whatever the surplus from their activities, from revenues or businesses, they cannot be distributed within the NGOs. So that is our key mechanism for all of the results. The problem with development NGOs is that this mechanism, this constraint, is not effectively enforced in many developing countries. And we have a few paper, for example, by Ardashev and Navarra, highlighting the little compliance to the sectoral norm regarding the non-distributional constraint in the NGO sector in developing countries. So in our model, what we're trying to do is we're trying to analyze how each of the following motivations, I'm going to talk about 5, would detect an NGO's decision following an increase in funding. The reason we're doing this is because it's inspired by our empirical setup. Okay, we've looked at this huge increase in funding in 2007, and we're trying to model that in our theory. Now, the first motivation that we should expect from a manager, regardless of whether this is an NGO or a for-profit firm, is they're trying to maximize the revenue. And they're trying to maximize their own salary. So if we think about extra revenue, an increase in funding, if that can be distributed amongst the employees, remember that in developing countries, the non-distributional constraint is not effectively enforced. So if they are purely driven by maximizing revenue or their own salaries, their reaction from a surge in funding would be to offer more and more activities, right? Because they are now involved in more activities, they have some justification to pay themselves more. So our prediction from this is that if they are purely driven by rent-seeking or revenue maximization, an increase in funding would be associated with a positive effect on diversification. They would be offering more activities. If they're trying to maximize their own personal perks, for example, they can fly to more 5-star hotels, fly on more business class flights. If they want to show their capacity as managers to improve their future success on the job market, if they want to signal their competence, if they want to signal their experience for future concern, or maybe just some ego gain, for example, some prestige of managing a very complex portfolio, or maybe just simply social status, right? I'm a very proud manager of a very complex NGOs. So if this is what really drives NGOs' decision to diversify, then the huge increase in funding would allow them to do it, right? They have more money to spend. So they would just, spend that onto more activities. So again, if the NGO is purely driven by personal perk maximization, our prediction is that an increase in funding would have a positive effect on diversification. We have some mathematical notation to prove on this, but here I'm just giving you the intuition. Now, in a more, I hope, positive note, so if they're trying to maximize social welfare, so if they're trying to offer more activities, offer more support to a wider communities, so the higher income, the higher revenue, the higher money coming in for them, they would be able to do that more often. So our prediction is, if the NGO is driven by maximizing social welfare or altruism, then an increase in funding would have a positive effect on diversification. If it is about operation, so risk reduction or cost complementarity, so if they diversify because they're trying to make sure that in the future they will be getting income donations from donors, or because they're trying to raise income from some relevant activities from their main core activity, then with an increase in funding, they don't need to do so anymore, right? Because they are having the money to focus on their actual objective, actual aim that they're trying to work on. So our prediction here is that if they are purely driven by operational related motivations, then an increase in funding, an increase in revenue, would have a negative effects on diversification. They would be diversifying less when they get more money. So to recap whatever I've just mentioned, we have two separate broad motivations. If an NGO is purely motivated by personal gain incentives, then we would either have a positive or relatively zero effects on diversification if the NGOs are getting some increase in the funding. If the NGO is purely driven by operational related motivations, then more money means they would want to diversify less. So they would have a negative effect. So if we go to the data, we look at how the NGO react to the increase in the funding, we check the side. That is going to be the main driving force behind NGO's motivation. So pretty much that is what we are going to do next. Because I'm running out of time, so I'm going to very much rush through what I prepared for the empirical analysis. So basically what we are using here, what we are using here is the data from NGO. We got about 400 NGOs in 2008, randomly sampled around Uganda. We have tons of information about their activities, spending, and managers' background. We will be measuring a number of activities as the actual number of activities that they report to us in the survey. We'll be measuring increase in funding by the proportion of the income from donors or user memberships or local donations. The reason why we are focusing on that is that these fundings are normally contractual, meaning that they have to sign a contract, they have to explain some specific objectives before they get those funding. And then we have a bunch of control variables as well to reduce arbitrary variable bias. These are the activities that we have. So we have many activities for NGOs in 2008. I think a more interesting figure is here. So the NGOs have about from 4 to 5 activities. They offer 4 to 5 activities in 2008. And the most that they offered was about 10 activities in a year. Now, of course, we will be worried about all of this endogeneity, so arbitrary variable bias and reverse causality. So what we are trying to look for in here, in our identification strategy, is to look at something that would affect the income received by the NGOs that doesn't have a direct effect on the diversification. What we are using is the historic flood in 2007. In here, I have the red spike for 2007. That was the biggest flood in 100 years, and is had a severe effect on about 10 districts in Uganda, and it led to a surge, huge surge in humanitarian aid targeting those affected districts. So our idea is to use that flood as the identification strategy. I think I'm gonna, so our first stage, I just want to say that it worked. So if the NGOs are located in the affected areas, so they had a very worse, they have some worsened working conditions, so they would be receiving a lot of incentives from donors to keep working in there. So as you can see, the first stage worked perfectly fine. We will be worrying, we'll be worried a little bit about the exclusion restriction. I can talk about that in the Q&A if you are curious. So we had a bunch of robustness checks, a lot of activities to justify our exclusion restriction. So there will be no difference between NGOs who worked in areas affected by extreme floods for 30 years. We're ruling out many channels as well. We will also do an analysis using within NGO variation. So we're looking at NGOs who change their funding and who change their diversification level over 2002 and 2007 to complement to our between NGOs analysis. What we get is pretty robust results. We found some negative sign effects. We found it in many specifications using within NGOs or across NGOs. I'm going to skip that because I think it's not too interesting. Right. The conclusion, I believe we are running out of time. So the conclusion, higher reliance on funding, on stakeholder funding, reduces diversification for Ugandan NGOs. It is consistent with our theoretical model in which NGOs are mainly driven by the need to reduce risk related to their operation. We have, of course, some drawbacks of how we approach this. For example, we can't really distinguish the good and the bad personal gain, for example, altruism, social welfare maximizing. And of course, our estimates are not, globally applicable. So there are still lots of cautions that we need to make on this paper. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Khan. Okay, I think that's good news for all of us development practitioners, that we know that at least in times of sort of this humanitarian crisis, when often indeed the contributions and funding to NGOs increase, they don't diversify their actions, but actually focus on what they know how to do best. Okay, now may I ask you to join me on the panel, and hopefully we'll have Christine also online so that she can hear us. It's time for questions. I hope you have all had a time to think questions to our distinguished researchers. So the floor is open for any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anke Höfler. You didn't have much time to present relatively complex papers, so maybe I just missed something. So let me just ask some clarification questions. First to Carlo Kors. So the information campaign, why do you think giving people information would lead them to vote and do all sorts of other, civic duties? I'm missing that link. Because knowing about a donor program, why should I engage more with my state? Because, there's a disconnect, I think, generally between aid and actually what my state does, because the aid definitely doesn't come from my state. I've been told that, this comes from US aid or well, in your case, from the German government. So why should I have a different attitude towards my local state then? And about the last paper, I just haven't understood why? So you get a flood, and then there's a diversification of activities, yeah, but it's not according to personal gain, but because you are altruistic and want to help people. So, but why does the diversification sort of surprise us? Most of these NGOs seem to be involved in training, but training is definitely not an activity. Yeah, that was the top one, training and education. And of course, that's not something you can do in these sort of extreme situations. So of course, you know, if I'm looking to channel additional aid in a desperate, you know, one in a century sort of situation, then of course I'm going to sort of ask any NGO that's already on the ground, on a register, you know, who's got the seal of approval. So I'm not that surprised. And why should they use it in that situation for personal gain? I mean, this is a shock, you know, not a planned thing. So I'm a bit at a loss to sort of understand what I can take away from this.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, let's take a few more maybe, and then you can answer. Is that okay?
Thank you. I thought I should ask my question next because it's actually for Christine, just to create some nice symmetry here. It's Tim Donay from Wilfrid Laurier University. It's odd to be asking a question to someone who I can't see. I presume and hope she's out there somewhere. There she is. No, we got her. Christina, I'm hoping this won't be an unfair question given from your presentation, I gather that you're still at the relatively early stages of the program, of your research program. But having done some work on security sector reform myself and thought, at least to a certain degree, about questions of accountability, I find your numbers very surprising, and just in terms of the relative absence of misconduct oversight bodies and peace agreements. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, even preliminary, as to what to make of that. I mean, given the importance of accountability and security sector reform, which is one of the central pillars of the whole enterprise, this seems to me somewhat of a shocking empirical result that the gap between the aspiration and the actual reality seems particularly profound here. And I'm wondering if it's just a resistance on the part of the police themselves to be drawn in, indifference on the part of elites. I'm just curious as to how we might explain your findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll now take answers, as we had one question for each. Do you have a microphone there? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, okay.
Okay, maybe if you want to start.
Yeah, thank you, Anke, for this question. It's a good one. So I think what I need to emphasize more is that this is a program that is funded, among others, by the German government, but the Malian state is basically the responsible institution. So when the German government or a German flag would not show up in this program, and it's a continuous program that has been, it's a decentralization program that the Malian government does each year, and the way it works actually is that communities, each community or commune in Mali has drawing rights, so droit de tirage. So what they do is each year they are allocated according to poverty levels, according to government performance, according to population size, a certain amount of funding. This is information actually that you can actually get on the website of this government agency. So it's public information, but of course not many people know about it. And our intuition behind providing, among others, this information is, in this case, they really associate, or should, in theory, associate this program with the state. It's very specific, and not have local strongmen elite capture these projects, right? So it's the idea is like to make this attribution to the state more explicit, which reflects the facts on the ground, and why we think that this can change local citizen-state relationships is I probably should say a little bit more how we measure that, because it's an index based on several survey items where we try to ask people very specific behavioral type questions. So for instance, whether people plan to vote in the next election is probably a really difficult question actually to get clear answers, but also if people how likely they would be to report irregularities that they notice in this project to the local mayor and the local council, whether they would what else? Pay taxes to upkeep basic services. So it's self-reported, anticipated behavior, which is, of course, not ideal if you ask development economists, because it's not strictly behavioral. But we are trying to get more to better, reliable measures. So it's a way to move away from this, how much do you trust the government, which is, in our perception, extremely vague and relying a lot on other factors that are just quite distant actually. So we're trying to capture these local state citizens interactions and see if this has an effect actually.
Shall we take Con then next, and then Christina maybe?
Thanks, thanks Anke for that question. I think the key idea behind the question is it not obvious that NGOs, after being affected by the flood, they would focus on activities that would be obviously getting support from the donors. So that's how I understand your comments and questions. So I need to clarify one point, that the slide that I showed you was for the activities in the end of 2008. So actually after the flood happened. As you can see, they didn't really switch to humanitarian or construction or community rebuilding activity yet. So I would try to rule out the explanation that NGOs were trying to refocus themselves into those flood-related activities. We don't observe that in the data, because they still maintain all of those activities as they were before the flood. In terms of econometrics, I guess the idea is maybe the flood has some direct effect on the level of diversification, not just through the income increase itself, but maybe it made it harder for the NGOs to work because of the flood, right? So maybe they cannot expand in terms of activities because the condition is very bad after the flood. So I think to answer that, the econometric analysis is we have to show there mustn't any direct effect of a huge flood on NGO diversification. So in the paper, what we did is, so in 2001, in November 2001, there was another huge flood as well. It wasn't as historic as the 2007 flood, but it was the second or the third biggest flood in Ugandan history. And what we saw was that in 2007, there was no increase in the revenue or donations going to Ugandan NGOs. That is, even in 2001, so even there were this huge flood, that may worsen the working conditions for the NGOs. We didn't see any increase in the funding towards the NGOs. So if you think about the IV estimate, the first stage is none. So there would be no first stage. So if our exclusion restriction holds, meaning that the flood would have no effect, would have no direct effect on the NGO diversification, we should observe no effect of the 2001 flood on the NGO level of diversification in 2002 as well. And that is exactly what we saw in the data as well. So I hope that my long answer would touch into 2 points. First, we don't observe an expansion into flood-related activities in 2008. Second, we have a robustness check to show that a flood, regardless of how large it is, would not affect the NGO diversification level directly. So the rest is we have to use our theoretical model to explain why we are seeing this lower level of diversification. And I hope that is the contribution of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you. And then over to Christine to answer to the question.
Great, thank you. So your question was about the surprisingly low numbers of police misconduct oversight in peace agreements. And I obviously don't have an answer for you, or a definitive answer for you, but my intuition is it's partly related to the role of the police during the armed conflict. So in a separate project, I'm looking to see how often the police are involved in the fighting and in the violence that takes place in armed conflict. And I think, just reflecting on this literature, I find them to be quite siloed. So when you're looking at the security sector reform literature and the post-conflict sort of stability literature, it doesn't often reflect on what roles exactly the security sector actors had during armed conflict. And in that, the data that I have managed to kind of wrangle, which is a 10-year period from about 2010 to 2020, what I find is that in armed conflict, only about 6% of the fatalities, or 6%, 7% of the events involve the police. And this is, the nature of the data is a little tricky, so this is kind of best understood as a baseline, but even taking that into consideration, I think it's safe to say that the police are involved, for the most part, in a minority of the violence, although it's an important minority, but a minority of the violence during armed conflict. And so I think that's often why they may not be high on the agenda when it comes time to start, hammering out the details of a peace agreement, both because peace agreements tend to focus on the bigger issues related to governance and security actors, but also because their role, while I think it's very non-negligible and important, isn't typically the primary role in armed conflict, and so therefore they don't get put in the spotlight in the same way.
Thank you, Christine. Other questions? Okay, good, great. There and then, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. I have a question for Khan. I found this really interesting, and despite the caveat that you had on your last slide, I'd like you to push you a little bit more on this point. I'm wondering how you'll go about solving the identification problem, given that both sort of, rent-seeking or revenue maximization as well as altruism result in increased diversification. And that to me was perhaps the most interesting bit in the paper. So moving ahead, how would you actually identify what the driver of increased diversification is? Thanks.
Thanks. Let's take a few more. I saw there was one hand in front. Any others?
Quite different question. This is a question from a civil servant perspective, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Sweden. I'm Camilla Lindström Rebind, and this is for Christina as well. I'm just wondering, I'm just curious if you have looked at peer-to-peer cooperation, that is like donor country police agencies working with peers from partner countries, and if that has had a positive effect on outcomes when it comes to police violence, if you have worked in this area at all. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other? Yep, okay.
Two questions for Khan. It was a really interesting presentation. So the first one is, I can think of a theoretical reason why diversification might increase in following an income shock if you consider the fixed costs of sort of entering a new type of intervention. Higher income means that you can pay for that fixed cost, so obviously that's not what you find, but I think there's a different story there as well if you include fixed costs in your model. The second one is your test. As I understand it correctly, you find no effect on income of the 2001 flood in Uganda. So November 2001 was the first phase of the Afghanistan war. So I was wondering whether sort of the crowding out of other news might affect the donor response to that flood. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, then I'll make one question for Carlo, so that you'll all have one to answer. Now, this comes from the point of view of conflict-affected context, which was, also sort of the context you were looking into this information area. Of course, one area, especially these days, that is central in many conflicts is information war. So how do you see sort of that perhaps affecting also the way that these kind of information campaigns can be functional, or maybe some challenges that they face in this kind of context? But let's start with maybe Khan, if you want to start answering.
Okay, so I think I have 3 questions, and 2 of them are very, very difficult. So can I just start with the easier one? So about the fixed cost. So we do capture that in the cost complementarity. Well, in the model, we have this function to capture that cost complementarity. So basically, we're saying that if the 2 activities are related, so the cost could be quite low. If they are expanding into some, widely different activity, then the cost is going to be huge. So I hope that we captured that in the model, in the theoretical model. I didn't really explain too much in my talk. Right. So back to the other 2 questions. So to answer the question about how can I identify the impure altruism and personal maximization, revenue maximization, I have to be honest, I don't know. That's why I wasn't able to push the analysis further. My idea that I kept in my mind is to perform a different analysis. So I cannot use the data that I have to answer that question. So maybe I have to do some experiments. Maybe I have to use a different data set to answer that. But of course, that is the key that I really want to tease out. I'm not sure if that is satisfactory, but that's the best I can do. For the other question on, I just forgot. The tutorial one, sorry. I didn't think about it, so I have to be honest. I didn't think about that explanation for my results. However, I still believe that my econometric analysis still holds. That is, I don't find a first stage estimate. I don't find the reduced form or the second stage estimate. It means my theoretical indirect effect still holds. But yeah, honestly, I forgot about the war and how it could have affected the donation situation to Uganda. Yeah, but I believe that wouldn't change my result. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then maybe Christina, if you want to answer the next question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Camilla, for this question. I think it touches on what I was ending on in my slides in terms of, my starting point being looking at whether these institutions were created in the process of peace agreements. But I think the natural extension is to look and see whether they were created after the end of armed conflict, even if they weren't mentioned in peace agreements through other processes, which are sometimes purely domestic, but I think a lot of times involve donors. So, if we think about like Bosnia, for example, there were several, the public complaints bureaus were created for sort of measuring police misconduct oversight, and that was facilitated by the EU police mission. And so we have lots of examples where those sorts of things occur, and that is, I think, the natural place to then collect these data. And I think it would be really interesting to see the extent to which they arise under donor pressure rather than through sort of the processes of conflict resolution and peace agreements.
Thank you, and then over to Carlo.
Yeah, Sala, thank you. This is an excellent question. So basically what it boils down to is, information campaigns can be used as a propaganda tool, which they often have been, no doubt about that, to influence voters, spread ideologies and all of that. That's true. So what we try to do is to strictly stay away from priming respondents or portraying the government in any favorable light. So we try to stick really to factual information that is actually publicly available, right? It's about formal rules, how this selection and allocation should work. Now, there's another thing whether it's really implemented that way, but giving citizens this information gives them a tool to say, okay, what do we observe on the ground? And if they don't observe that, there is a potential for them to engage with local governments. If they finally do it, also again depends on a lot of other things, because maybe you are afraid of engaging or requesting such information, right? That's of course a problem, but that would affect both control and treatment groups to a similar degree. But I think that's a very, very, very valid point that you raise. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we are almost running out of time. If there's any final question we can take. If not, oh, yeah, sure.
Can I maybe add a comment? Yes. Those discussions were very interesting. Actually, it reminds me of our team's research on public perceptions on aid. Actually, we were investigating into the Chinese public's perceptions on aid. So it's on the supply end. But I think that's quite related. Actually, we found out it's very interesting. We did a national survey, 3,000, 4,000 samples. So it's a very large national survey. And finally, we got this whole samples back, and only more than 1,000 samples, they asked our questions on aid. So people has very limited knowledge on aid. Obviously, in emerging economies, this aid issue is still not a public topic. People are not talked about it a lot. So people have very limited knowledge on it. So that's a very important thing, I think, that's related to people's, if people are supportive for aid. And then we look at whether people are supportive for providing aid. So we find out it's very interesting. Most of the people are saying, oh, it's necessary to have aid. We should have aid. So that perception is very high, actually, more than 80%. But when we add a question of, do you want us to increase aid? Then most people say no. So it's very, very interesting. I think the supportive thing, they have different dimensions. And then we followed some, analysis on what kind of factors influencing people's, their supports for aid. And we found out those effectiveness thing really matters. If they think aid has a very good result, they will tend to support aid. And if they think, and also people have very high trust on the state, especially on the national government instead of local government, they tend to support aid very much, more tendencies. And also the estimate on the scale of the aid also matters. If they think current level of aid is too high, then they tend to, say decrease, not increase. Okay, so just want to share with you some.
Thank you very much for that sharing. Any other? No? Okay, then we say thank you to our researchers. And I think it's time to end today and move over to the dinner. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.